Okay, we continue our series on the life of David, and last week Rebecca took us through David's lament of the death of Saul and Jonathan, and that also represented the transition from the book of 1 Samuel to the book of 2 Samuel. And now we get into chapter 2, which is where David he begins his royal ascent, and it's a bit of a process. But before we get into the text in 2 Samuel 2, I want you to think about this question, and that is, what are some ways that you seek guidance from God in your life? Okay, let's pick it up in verse 1 of 2 Samuel 2. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. And the Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. So David went up there with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. So, after lamenting the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, David's first act was to inquire of the Lord for guidance as to how to proceed. The death of King Saul had removed the most obvious roadblock to David's return to Israel and to following the path of becoming king for which he had been anointed by Samuel. So his first act, which is seeking God's will, came before other kinds of things he could have done, such as like recruiting a bigger army, laying out a strategy on how to proceed, or maybe even beginning a public relations campaign and becoming political about becoming king. Now, some of these things would happen, but the important thing is that they happen in terms of God's direction and not David's direction. So David's first question, shall I go to one of the towns of Judah? See, Judah is David's tribal territory, where they'll probably be likely to be supportive of one of their own in their ascension to the kingdom. But we also know in the past and that David had some resistance from his own tribal members. So David's first question was, shall I go to one of the towns of Judah? And then his second question is, where shall I go? And this is where we get the Lord's direction. The Lord directed David to go to Hebron. So why Hebron? Hebron was the largest city of refuge in the area. So kind of makes you think, was David in need of the protection of a city that offered refuge? A city of refuge was a city that was set aside for someone who was linked to a murder or had accidentally committed murder or was wrongly accused of murder, and they could go to a city of refuge and receive protection until the issue could be sorted out. Hebron was also a Calebite city, and perhaps because David had married Abigail, the widow of a Calebite, you may remember the story of Nabal, perhaps that would help him be more acceptable to the people in Hebron, because he had married the widow of a Calebite. Hebron was also a city that was set aside for the Aaronic priesthood. And this is important because the presence of Abiathar, who is an Aaronic priest, in David's company would likely increase the readiness of those in the region to accept David and the reestablishment of the priesthood in that city. So David's company went to Hebron in obedience to what the Lord had directed and settled in and around there. So there's the main city of Hebron, and then there's the towns and the areas around it where they would have settled. Which is kind of interesting, because if you think about David's group, we talk about around 600 soldiers, 600 of his men, and then it includes their families. So there's probably well over 1,000 people that would settle in this area. That would have quite an impact. So they settle in Hebron and around the area of Hebron. And then after that, it just quickly goes, the text quickly goes to the idea that the men of Judah, so that around the area, came to Hebron, and they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. And even though in previous events Judah had previously opposed David or not supported him, this text gives no indication of resistance within the tribe. It seems they readily accept David as their leader. And so when we look at the direction God gave David to go to Hebron, it seems to make sense in a lot of ways. So here's a question. Does obedience to God always seem to make sense, or does it sometimes seem counterintuitive? I'll give you a few minutes to think that one through. Okay, let's pick it up in verse 4, partway through verse 4. It says, "When David was told that it was the men from Jabesh Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to them to say to them, 'The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul your master by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then, be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the people of Judah have anointed me king over them.'" You see, David's path to becoming king of all Israel progresses in two ways. First, there's the way of diplomacy, and then next we will see the way of battle or war. And so in verses 4 to 7 here, we see an example of David reaching out to Jabesh Gilead with a promise to show them kindness in return for the kindness they showed for Saul. Now this is interesting because David, as we know, was considered to be Saul's enemy by Saul, and so therefore probably by those who were loyal to Saul would perceive David as an enemy. So David, who was perceived to be an enemy of Saul, could easily be considered to be an adversary of those who supported Saul, unless David could convince them otherwise. And this appears to be an attempt on David's part of a diplomatic way to begin to extend his influence over Israel. Now, of course, the other way that this takes place is represented in the war between David's house and Saul's house. So let's pick it up in verse 8. "Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Ashuri, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So it appears that outside of Judah, in the rest of Israel, the most powerful person was Abner, who's the army commander. He's Saul's cousin and commander of Saul's army. And Abner had Ishbosheth, Saul's remaining son, anointed king over all Israel. So, Ishbosheth at the time of the Philistine Wars would have been a fighting age, obviously. But it would have been common for the king to set aside, if he had multiple sons, to put aside one son in case, the worst case scenario happened, which did, where Saul and Jonathan and his sons were killed. But Ishbosheth was not in the battle, so he would have remained alive. And now, at this point, Abner, who is the commander of Saul's army, he appoints Ishbosheth as the king over all Israel, and they do it at a city called Mahanaim, which is a city east of the Jordan, so it would have been safe from attacks from the Philistines. But Ishbosheth's reign as king, which we see as 2 years, is rather tenuous, considering that he had to deal with the ongoing threat of the Philistines, as well as the growing threat of Judah in the south, who declared their loyalty to David and had no interest in declaring loyalty to Ishbosheth. But Ishbosheth managed to hang on for 2 years. Now this creates a bit of a question in terms of the timing of this, but most scholars think this coincided with the last 2 years of David's 7.5 years of being king of Judah before becoming king over all Israel. So verses 4 to 7 show an example of David's diplomacy, whereas these next verses describe the conflict between the house of David and the house of Saul, and the prize being the crown of Israel. So in verse 12, let's pick it up there. Abner, son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim, and went to Gibeon. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool, and one group sat on the other side. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." "All right, let them do it," Joab said. So they stood up, were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin, and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkath Hazurim, or the field of hostilities. The place where they met, the two opposing forces at this point, at the pool of Gibeon, and according to archaeological evidence found in the late 1950s, this place was a hand-carved reservoir that was said to be 37 feet in diameter and 82 feet deep. Quite an accomplishment. Anyway, they meet on either side of this reservoir, and Abner's idea is to have 2 small groups of young men fight it out, but this solved nothing, and all it did was result in heightening the tension, and there resulted a fierce battle between the armies of Ishbosheth, or led by Abner, and the armies of David, led by Joab. The battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the Israelites were defeated by David's men. The 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle, and he chased Abner, turning neither to the right nor to the left as he pursued him. Abner looked behind him and asked, "Is that you, Asahel?" "It is," he answered. Then Abner said to him, "Turn aside, to the right or to the left, take on one of the young men, and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. Again, Abner warned Asahel, "Stop chasing me. Why would I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face?" But Asahel refused to give up the pursuit. So Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. He fell there and died on the spot. And every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and as the sun was setting, they came to the hill of Ammah, near Giah, on the way to the wasteland of Gibeon. Then the men of Benjamin rallied behind Abner, and they formed themselves into a group and took their stand on top of a hill. Abner called out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites?" Joab answered, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued pursuing them until morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the troops came to a halt. They no longer pursued Israel, nor did they fight any more. All that night Abner and his men marched through Arabah. They crossed the Jordan, continued through the morning hours, and came to Mahanaim. Then Joab stopped pursuing Abner and assembled the whole army. Besides Asahel, 19 of David's men were found missing, but David's men had killed 360 Benjamites who were with Abner. They took Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb at Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men marched all night and arrived at Hebron by daybreak. So the description of this particular battle starts with telling us who wins, and that is that David's men defeat Abner and his men on this day. And then verses 18 to 23 feature an event within the battle, which is of Asahel, brother of Joab, and Abishai chasing Abner. It appears that Asahel is not well armed, whereas Abner is. Abner even suggests to Asahel to take on one of the young fighters and acquire their weapons. I guess maybe to make it more of an even battle. It also appears that Abner is not excited about the prospect of killing Asahel because he would then have to face Joab, which I think is not a good idea. In the end, Abner kills Asahel, although the manner of his death indicates that Abner may have been trying to avoid killing Asahel, as he struck him with the butt of his spear, not the point. But Asahel's force in running forward probably caused even the blunt end to go through him, resulting in his death. At any rate, the death appears so unusual that every man who came upon it stopped at that place. But the battle then ends with Abner and his men up on a hill, which gives them the offensive advantage, and they had assumed a formation after they had been pursued. And so Abner convinces Joab to end the pursuit. Shall we go on fighting? It could only end in more bitterness. But as a result of this battle, David lost 19 men plus Asahel, so 20 men, and Abner lost 360 men. So in the end, even though the battle ended probably prematurely, it was a convincing win for David. We then go on to chapter 3, and the first verse gives us a summary of what the result of all this is. And it says that the war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. And David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Then verses 2 to 5 says, "Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Chileab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, the son of David's wife Eglah. They were born to David in Hebron." So chapter 3:1 provides the commentary on what would take place. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker, and this leads eventually to the establishment of David becoming king over all Israel. The list of sons born to David in Hebron is a foreshadowing of the dynasty that was being built, in that this list is the order of royal succession. So what we see in this account is a pattern that is observable throughout the history of Israel. Entering the land, this is the pattern, entering the land, a period of blessing, then desolation and exile, followed by a return. We have David entering the scene, remember the story of Goliath, and for a period of time experiencing blessing as his reputation grows in the nation. But then this results in having to flee and ultimately live in exile. Remember his years with the Philistines. Then returning to Hebron and Judah and beginning his royal ascent. So we have this sort of pattern that we see throughout this nation, but reflected in David's experience as he enters, blessing, exile, and then return. You see, earlier in Israel's history, we see Abraham, who's the first. He possesses the land. Then we have the establishment of the tribes of Israel, but then this ends up in exile to Egypt because of famine. And then we see this resulting many years later, 400 and whatever years later, that they return under the leadership of Joshua after Moses had led them out of Egypt. But you have this same pattern of entrance, blessing, and establishment, exile for one reason or another, but then return. Later in Israel's history, we'll see in the era of the kings, the establishment of the kings, and a long time of rulership in Israel, and then later just in Judah and Benjamin, but a time of the rule of kings in Israel. But then we see this ultimately end in the exile to Babylon. And again, so we have this establishment of the nation, the establishment of their kingdom, but then exile again, and when Babylon takes over. But then this results in the return again under Ezra, Zerubbabel, and Nehemiah years later. So again, we see this pattern established. And what does this show us? Well, these stories, whether it's of David, whether it's of the exit from Egypt and then re-entry into the land, or the exile to Babylon, re-entry to the land, or we see David in exile, then re-entry into Hebron before he becomes king of all Israel. These stories serve as an object lesson of unchanging theological truth learned from the Old Testament, depicting the Lord's blessing, the Lord's judgment, and then restorative mercy. So these are truths about God and how he relates to his people that we see in these object lessons in the Old Testament. But these things also are true in our experience as followers of Jesus. That we experience the Lord's blessing. Sometimes we experience his judgment and discipline. And then other times we are recipients of his restorative mercy as his grace is bestowed on us and his salvation is always new. So I'd like to end our time today with this table talk. How have these truths about God, his blessing, judgment, and restorative mercy influenced your journey? And maybe you can think of examples of these things and then take time to pray. And we'll see you next week.